Hi, I'm Will Zockman, editor and publisher of the Duxbury Times, Duxbury, Massachusetts 24/7 online newspaper. In the course of looking at some things in the town recently concerning a schools proposition that's coming up at town meeting in March, we started digging into the background of the Massachusetts school policy and educational policy and the policies of Governor Deval Patrick. And in the course of doing that, we discovered some very interesting things. We found that when we dug into things more deeply than the standard media has so far, the rather comatose local media these days, that there is a very clear pattern to what's going on in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that when you apply the standards that say, look at what they do, not what they say, and add to that the other wise old principle, follow the money, it becomes very clear that the educational policy, so-called educational policy, a supportive education on the part of the Patrick administration, is to a considerable extent a scam. When you actually look at what the result of the government policies is on education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you discover that, in fact, the governor's policies are not really supporting education properly. They're not concerned with education, and that the Massachusetts School Building Authority, the MSBA, headed by Tim Cahill, or at least he's the director, is in fact not fostering education at all. The clue to this, the way we discovered this in the first place and began to then dig into the details, was listening to a Board of Selectmen's meeting the other day where the school department came in and said, we barely have enough budget to do what we need to do, followed by a presentation for a $130 million project to build brand new schools. Now, intuitively, there's something wrong with this picture. We're talking about spending $130 million for brand new schools, but we don't have enough money to properly fund the ongoing operating budget of the school department. What's going on here? And what's the role of the state in this? Well, when we looked at this, what we found is that the policy, Governor Patrick's policy for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that ostensibly is aiding education, isn't really, or at least that's at best a secondary effect of what's really going on. Because what we see is that the immediate situation that we're seeing in Duxbury, not enough money for operating budgets, but ostensibly a lot of state money and a lot more tax money to be collected locally in order to build a new school, or two new schools really as one. That is a reflection of state policy, of the policy of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and of the Patrick administration. Because here's the deal, here's the real deal of what's going on. The Massachusetts School Building Authority is not primarily, if you look at what they do, not what they say, about education. It's primarily about funneling money to people who build buildings, to contractors, to influential contributors, to the trades unions, and to the various feeder fish that make money on projects. What we've got here is a situation where the state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is cutting local aid to schools. At the same time, they're aggressively pushing projects that are building projects for new schools. And the reason for that is not education. If education was genuinely their concern, what they should be doing, what they would be doing, if they really meant what they say, is that they would first of all be attacking the issue of standards for teachers, which of course is unacceptable because of the role of the teachers unions in the picture. But they would be aggressively going for the idea that you should reward good teachers and get rid of bad ones. But in fact, they're not doing that. They have no interest in doing that. They would also be providing more money for operating budgets for local schools. They're not interested in doing that either. What they're interested in doing is holding out the promise of free money to cities and towns to build new schools, in a context which then induces the cities and towns to raise their local taxes substantially in order to fund this. It's the approach from the state is like, we'll give you money through the MSBA, Massachusetts School Building Authority, but then you have to raise a bunch yourself. And the only way to raise that for most cities and towns, as for Duxbury, is to raise taxes. But they're not providing, they're cutting local aid to schools at the same time they're trying to shovel this money out in a deal that's sort of a get one free, but by the time you pay the shipping and handling, pay the postage, it results in huge increases in taxes for a school which then, when it's adopted, when it's built, doesn't have sufficient money to operate properly. And that has a hard time getting it because the taxes, the local taxes, have already been jacked up so much in order to pay for the school that nobody wants to spend the extra money. What we've got here is a sort of a big welfare program for the building industry. That's really what it amounts to. That's really what they're doing. And not only is that the fundamental of it, but one of the first things that Deval Patrick's administration did to grease the skids for this one? They gutted Proposition 2.5, because the dirty little secret, and we've got an article already up on the website of the Duxbury Times called 2.5 Myths, that talks about how in 2007, Patrick and the legislature gutted Proposition 2.5. The whole idea of Proposition 2.5 in the first place was to create additional barriers to spending beyond a certain point. It never was the case that 2.5 limited spending to 2.5, but it was the case that it put some restraint on spending by requiring supermajorities, 2/3 supermajorities, in order to pass budget-busting projects that went beyond the confines of 2.5. What the legislature did under our dear governor's divine guidance in 2007, with obviously a lot of help from the Democrats in the legislature and the contributions from the building industry and the trades unions, was they gutted 2.5 by making a change that cosmetically looks like it's the same thing, but it isn't. And the change was to create this fantasy zone of so-called temporary debt exclusions that no longer require a supermajority in the general election. Now, theoretically, they still stay within the spirit of 2.5 because they require a 2/3 vote by the quote, the appropriating authority. That's the city council in the case of most cities, or the town meeting, or the representative town meeting, whatever it happens to be in the case of many of the towns. In the case of Duxbury, that's the town meeting. But it's easy, relatively, to pack a town meeting and get 2/3 majority. It used to be under 2.5 prior to 2007, prior to Patrick and friends in the Beacon Hill gang gutting 2.5. You had also to have a 2/3 majority in the general election. They eliminated that, which basically means that they reset things pretty much to where they were before 2.5, de facto. You could argue that maybe it's a little more difficult now, but it's not that much more difficult. The reality of it is that the first thing they did was remove the protections of 2.5, and then now they're shoveling out all this money. The Mass School Building Authority likes to brag about the 4.7 or however many $billion it is that they have shipped out to the cities and towns, but they do it as a teaser, and then they require expenditures on the part of the cities and towns to greatly increase the tax rate. If you look at the cities and towns and see those that have bought this scam, what you find is their academic scores don't actually improve significantly at all. Their taxes go up through the roof, and it helps us take, as we have been doing since Patrick got to be governor, one more big step toward restoring the grand old days of Taxachusetts, because that's what's really happening here. And the worst part of it is that that's what our good dear friend President Barack Obama wants to do and is doing on the national level. It's time we put a stop to this. It's time we said no mas, no more. We are not going to be allowing the government to scam us this way. We want good education, but we don't want to be scammed in a way that is really just subsidizing the construction industry, the contractors and the contributors and the special interests and the trades unions, at the expense of all the rest of the taxpayers. That's just some sort of weird middle class or upper class welfare. The upper class doesn't need welfare. Real people do.